Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you find yourself in the world today. We're glad you joined us for this Church Goes Global webinar. My name is Andrew Gale.
And I am Nate Tatman, and we are so thankful that you've joined us today. And before we get into today's topic, we wanted to remind you why we invest the time and energy to bring you these conversations about the church and how you can engage during this webinar.
So Church Goes Global looks at current cross-cultural issues through the lens of local North American church engagement. So we invite guest speakers to talk about their experience and share from their expertise, connecting back to how your local church can be on mission in this world.
And if you've never been a part of a Zoom webinar before, here are just a few pieces of information that might be helpful for you. First of all, as Andrew mentioned, this session is being recorded, and you can find it on the Global Strategy resource page as well as the Facebook page in the next week or so. Second, questions are welcome and encouraged. Feel free to write those questions and send those in at any time. They will not be visible to the rest of the participants, but Andrew and I will be able to see those and respond or ask them on your behalf. There are other features as well, like polls that we may utilize, and we definitely welcome and want your participation. And this is our final webinar for this fall, or for this spring series, but we will be back in the fall with 4 more guests and talking about some more important topics. Our next webinar will be on August 14th. So put that on your calendars. And as always, we will send out email reminders and ways to sign up for that.
So one last quick note we want to let people know about: June 9th is coming up, about a week from Sunday, and that is Pentecost Sunday. So we're encouraging churches during this time to engage in missions conversations as we remember this important event in the life of the church. So if you are looking for resources to engage your church in those conversations, we wanted to let you know that Global Strategy has a number of free resources, which include like sermon starters. We have kids curriculums, videos, music, all kinds of different stuff on our website. So if you go to chodglobal.org/Pentecost Life, all one word, it'll take you to a web page that has all kinds of stuff that you can engage in, daily devotionals, all kinds of things that you can do to engage your church and start a conversation about what God's doing around the world. So today, let's get to the good stuff. Today, we are joined by Gena Thomas. She's an author, a speaker, international development advocate. Gena, thank you so much. Welcome. We're glad you're here today. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be a part. Yeah. Well, let me give you a little bit of context about Gena before we let her jump into her spiel and teach us some from her research. So I first connected with Gena through her book, her first book. It's called A Smoldering Wick. It was referenced in a blog and someone recommended the book to me, so I picked up a copy. And I loved the way that Gena weaves the theme of justice in with international development work. And she connects it all of that to how North American teams engage in healthy ways globally. And I was really hooked in the way that she presented her argument and the way that she talked about it. So the more I learned about Gena's history, the more I was just impressed with her. Gena and her husband, Andrew, they were missionaries in northern Mexico, and they launched a coffee shop called El Búho, which means the owl. And the shop still serves a local international population near a climbing hotspot outside of Monterey. Her passion for development work led her to a place called the Chalmers Center. I feel like people don't know what the Chalmers Center is, but everybody has heard of the book When Helping Hurts. So the Chalmers Center is the organization that gave us the book When Helping Hurts. And they're just all about helping churches do healthy cross-cultural development. That's really their impetus. And so she's currently an instructional design specialist with the Chalmers Center. But there's more. Gena has a book coming out very soon called Separated by the Border. It's about her experience fostering a child that was separated from her mother at the US-Mexico border. Just another fascinating, there's also articles online you can find about her talking about that experience. Gena's been on Missions Podcast. She's been a speaker at a number of events, including a recent Q conference where she was a part of that speaking engagement. So you're busy. You are doing a ton of stuff. We're so thankful that you took some time to be with us. And we're honored to have you share some of your thoughts with us today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor for me to be a part and get to talk about some of my favorite stuff. So I'm pumped.
And Gena has a gift, a PDF that she sent that we'll be sending out after this webinar. So Gena, tell us about what that PDF is so they know what they're receiving.
Yeah, so the PDF is going to talk about in more detail. I'll highlight some of this within the presentation, but we're going to talk a little bit about tools of development. And so the PDF kind of goes into detail on some of those tools and specifies what they are. And hopefully those will be helpful resources for people who are looking for better ways to engage in their own context and their own communities, wherever they might be. And then I also talk about typology of participation within that PDF. So that goes into a lot more detail, but we'll again briefly talk about that within the presentation. And that's just really hopefully going to be a guide for people to understand what type of participation they're doing when they are involved in missions in their contexts.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for sharing that resource with us. We've invited Gena today to share a little bit about what she's learned through her experience and research on how local churches in North America can engage in healthy international development. And with churches around the world. So as always, if you have questions, please feel free to send those to us at any time, and we'll start compiling them for a Q&A time at the end. And I think that my audio is going in and out. So I'm going to quit talking and let Gena take over now, and we will let her present, and then we'll have some follow-up questions after she's done.
Awesome. Well, thank you. The last time I talked, it was for 9 minutes only. So this is a new and exciting moment to actually be able to talk a little bit longer. But I wanted to share a little bit about justice and mission. And those are two of my most favorite words in the world. And I think the reason behind that is because I really found the word justice from a biblical perspective as a missionary. It wasn't something that I really understood or dove into within the biblical context until I became a missionary, and actually after. So a lot of what I'm about to present today, you can find in my book, A Smoldering Wick. So if you need more information or want more, feel free to contact me, or I can send you more stuff about the book. But the book is basically the idea and the concept of merging international development principles and practices with short-term missions. And it's not just short-term missions, but it's really specific to short-term missions. And as a missionary, I saw a lot of, from the other end, I saw a lot of short-term missions teams kind of come in and then leave, and just kind of saw a lot of negative and maybe unhealthy patterns that were happening. And so my hope with the book is to kind of offer more long-term development mindsets for people who are going on short-term missions, and a way to do that with partnering with the communities that we work with. And so I've written a couple of books. I do speak sometimes, and most of the time I'm at work. So this is kind of all on the side as I'm able to. So but yeah, like Andrew said, I work at the Chalmers Center, really enjoying that. That's a recent development for me. And I get to work with people who are really passionate about the same kind of stuff. So it's been a really huge pleasure and a blessing for me. So let's dig in. As we talk today about justice and mission, it's really important to have a foundation of what the word justice is. And so I wanted to kind of lay a little bit of a backdrop of that. And really, this was revolutionary for me personally to understand justice better through the biblical foundation. There's two words in the Old Testament, two Hebrew words that we know of, that really give us this idea of justice. The first one is tzedakah, and the second one is mishpat. And tzedakah really means a life of right relationship. And that means that when we are in relationship with other people, we are doing things well, we are doing things right, we're giving people what is due to them, which is the definition of mishpat, and we're really living in a godly way towards others. And we'll talk a little bit more about other relationships that we have and how we can have justice within those other relationships. But that's really just a huge portion of why for me, why missions, it must be done out of a mindset of justice, is because I feel like if we have right relationship with the people around us and the communities that we're working in or serving in, it really changes a lot. And I think it's super important to have that foundation. So, a lot of times we kind of often hear that word in a negative context. Social justice can have negative connotations for certain people, depending on your background. It could have a positive connotation for you, but I really want to just get back to this idea that this is a very biblical concept. And it's very important for us as Christians to understand what the Bible is saying about justice and why we need to do our missions work out of that framework. And so relational missions isn't just a modernizing way of doing missions. It's really foundational to the origins of missions. And I really truly believe that. And it's really changed me and changed my life forever. And I think one of the biggest things that we deal with as the American church, American Christians, is that we often do our missions work out of a mindset of charity. And what I want to stress here is when I say this word charity, I don't mean the King James Version of the Bible talks a lot about charity, and in that it's actually talking about agape love, and that's not what I'm talking about here. When I'm saying the word charity, I'm specifically referring to a concept of giving to the needy. A lot of times when people think of charity, they think of handouts, and really there's a power play within that word, and I think it's important for us to recognize that, where typically it's the stronger person is giving to a weaker person. And I think that this is really damaging in the history of the church. It's a damaging mindset to have, and continues to be, whether you are in the power role or you're not. I think it's damaging on both ends. I really believe that it damages the imago Dei that's in all of us, that says that we are dignified, we are worthy, but we are also sinners. So we hold that dual role and that dual identity in balance, and it's very important to keep it in balance. And the concept of charity that we know of in America is really just this this idea that those who have give to those who don't have. One of the interesting things that I found in my research was a quote by Bono, and he talks about justice, and he says, I want to be clear about what this problem is and what this problem isn't, because it's not all about charity. This is about justice. This is not about charity. It's too bad, because we're very good at charity. Americans, like Irish people, are good at it. Even the poorest neighborhoods give more than they can afford. We like to give, and we give a lot. Look at the response to the tsunami. It's inspiring. But justice is a higher standard than charity. And I think that's really the essence of what I'm trying to get to in my research, is that charity is easier. Justice is a lot harder. It's a lot messier. It's a lot more difficult, but I really do believe it's more biblical. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we are wading in the messes of life to make sure that we are doing biblical justice in our relationships with other people, with other communities, and certainly in our relationship with God. So essentially what we're trying to get to is a paradigm shift between moving from doing justice or doing charity work to doing justice work. And it's really kind of difficult to shift our thinking as, the whole American church from this concept of charity, because we've kind of been taught that as Americans, especially, we're taught to kind of pull yourselves up from your bootstraps. We're taught to, a lot of us have had immigrant grandparents and parents, or people who started really poor and then kind of made their way into wealth or into the middle class. And so we kind of have this constant mindset that says, if you do work, if you do it this way, then you will get this result. And that's really very, very opposite of what I think the Old Testament lays out, especially when we're thinking through the word shalom, when we're thinking through the concept of gleaning, all these different things that kind of the Lord sets out for his people to really be countercultural in how they look at the world and how they look at bringing other people into what is abundant life. And so I think it's important. One of the things we often talk about at the Chalmers Center is for relationships. We talk about the relationship, self is kind of in the center of that picture. And that person has a relationship with God. A person has a relationship with themselves, with other people, and with creation. And when those relationships are broken, which they are in all of our instances, we have a poverty of spiritual intimacy when it comes to our relationship with the Lord. We have a poverty of being when it comes to our relationship with ourselves, a poverty of community when it comes to our relationships with other people, and a poverty of stewardship when it comes to creation. And so when we think about this word justice and we think about missions, it's really important to understand that we have these four core relationships with the world around us, and justice really requires a much tougher standard, like we just talked about, to really scrutinize those relationships and to really ask ourselves, where am I poor in my relationship with God? Where am I poor in my relationship with other people? How am I not stewarding the environment well? How am I not taking care of myself? And so really that justice is kind of first, and we need to turn it to ourselves. We need to look in the mirror in ourselves first and make sure that where we're coming from when we're trying to talk to other people about justice or missions or whatever it is that we're doing, we know where we stand. Because I think it's pretty easy for us in a charity mindset to just stand on a pedestal and say, I have this education, I can speak 2 languages, I have a master's degree, all this other kind of stuff that kind of puts me up on a pedestal and says, I can tell you exactly what you need to do for your community. When in reality, it's I need to be inflective of myself first, make sure that I know who I am. Again, that dual identity between being a child of God and being the greatest sinner that there ever was, and then really understanding the gospel in that sense before I can even go to anyone else and try to talk through how to do community development. So that's really the poverty, the paradigm shift that I'm hoping for with my book. I know there's a lot of other people who are kind of on this movement, which is really exciting to see, and I'm grateful for it. And you'll see this diagram or some version of it in books like Walking with the Poor, When Helping Hurts. Those are all, those are great books, great resources to have in going through this a little bit deeper and trying to understand all of this more. Let's see if I can. Okay. So now getting into international development, and I'll tie this all back around, I hope, well, in a little bit. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was international development. And the reason is because there's the spectrum within international development that most people agree with. And basically it says, if you see the little man right there, there's a lightning bolt, which is really revelatory of a crisis. A crisis happens, let's say it's a tsunami. A tsunami hits, and the very next thing that we do is relief. And as we move through this process, relief then turns into rehabilitation. So relief is just kind of trying to like put a Band-Aid on what's going on, like stop the bleeding. Let's make sure that everyone can handle the situation and still survive, right? And then we move into rehabilitation. And rehabilitation brings that person back to where they were prior to the crisis moment. And then development is kind of more sustainable working, trying to create a solution so that this crisis doesn't happen again, because oftentimes it's not a tsunami, it's maybe a job loss, or there could be several other different things. And when we're talking about poverty, it could be a myriad of issues or crises that cause that. And so I think when we're talking about charity and talking about justice, it's really, really important as American Christians, especially if we're leaders in any community, that we understand the spectrum and we really understand what our programs fit in. So if we are in charge of any kind of program, we're paying attention to what kind of assistance that we're giving to people. So if we're just giving relief all the time when really they need development, then that's really not doing justice. And if we're just doing rehabilitation when this is just going to keep happening and happening, that's not really justice. And so it's important for us to actually work towards sustainable solutions so that these kinds of things don't happen again. And so that Imago Dei is not marred on the people who we are helping, quote unquote, that we're paying attention to all of these different factors. Yeah. So this is kind of getting into the development, the tools of development, and this is where that PDF is going to come in handy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those different tools. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, we're talking about justice. One of the important things to understand is participatory development. So the Asian Development Bank has said that participatory development is a process through which stakeholders can influence and share control over development initiatives and over the decisions and resources that affect themselves. And again, if anyone is familiar with asset-based community development, this is really what it's getting at. It's basically that people have their own solutions to their own problems within themselves, and it's important that we walk alongside people and not tell them what to do or how to do it. And so participatory development, it comes in many, very many forms. It can be passive and active, and I think that's it's especially important to understand if we're doing passive or active participatory development, because it's pretty easy for passive participatory to just turn into, I'm going to tell you what you need to do. And that's not what we're trying to do when we're working towards biblical justice. And so another just a reality that I think we all know well, but just a reminder here that every tool can be used to harm or to build up. You think about a hammer, it can tear a house down, but it can also build one up. And so how tools are used are really important. It's not the tool itself, it's really how it's used. And so having the right mindset when we're using tools is probably the most critical thing, in my perception, one of the most critical things to have when we're using any tools, to know what we're using this tool for, what we're hoping to accomplish with it, and how to use it in a way that's not going to damage anyone in the process. So. And this is just a list of a couple of different tools. And like I said, that PDF is going to go into deep on each of these. So I'm not going to talk about all of them here, but I do want to tell you a couple of different things. So focus groups, I think most of us know what focus groups are. Basically getting a group of people together who are affected by whatever it is that we're dealing with, the program that we're trying to create, get a group of people stakeholders that will be affected by this, and really just talking through some of the stuff, asking them questions, trying to find out what their perceptions of what this program would be like, and maybe not even talking about programs, but talking about one of the things in here is a problem tree. So having a group of people come together and talk about what they think the problems in their community are, and then kind of talking through, okay, what are the root causes of those problems, and what can we do to kind of help find a sustainable solution to this problem. Asset mapping is where you go through and you map out, okay, what assets do we have as a group, as a community. There's a SWOT analysis, which probably a lot of people know from business, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. What are the strengths of this particular option? If we were to work towards this solution, what are the weaknesses of it? What are the opportunities and what are the threats? And I found it really interesting thinking through some of that stuff when we lived in Mexico. One of the things we were working towards was a school being built in an area. And one of the issues with that particular school being built is that it could be a threat to some of the gangs who are involved in that area, because it would be a threat to them, because it would be taking away some of their prime potential gang members by creating a school that would allow them to give an opportunity for these children in a certain way, but also be a threat. So we have to pay attention to this kind of stuff and really understand how is this going to affect the community that we're involved in, and why are we doing it? And are we doing this because we think that it's the most important thing to do, or are we doing it because the community is saying it's the most important thing to do? So, and then just getting into this typology of participation. This is probably one of my favorite things to geek out on. I really, really love it. Yeah, I'm a big geek. But one of the things that I found, this was just a typology that was done by Jules Preddy. He was a professor in Oxford, and he just kind of went through and talked about different levels of participation. So there's manipulative participation, passive participation, participation by consultation, participation for material incentives, functional participation, interactive participation, and then finally there's self-mobilization. And I think that when we are kind of walking alongside communities, it's really important for us to understand these different levels of participation and make sure that we're not doing manipulative participation, because really it's not justice. Passive participation is not justice. And again, just kind of thinking through this through a framework of biblical justice, that we need to make sure that we are doing these things in ways that will bring forth that imago Dei, that dignity that is God-given to every human being within the communities that we work with. And self-mobilization, which I wanted to just to read that one, but self-mobilization is the final one, and that's kind of the hope at the end. And this is when people participate by taking initiatives independently of external institutions to change systems. They develop contacts with the external institutions for resources and technical advice that they need, but retain control over how resources are used. Self-mobilization can spread if governments and NGOs provide an enabling framework of support. Self-initiative mobilization may or may not challenge existing distributions of wealth and power. In each of these participations in the typology that I've created, I've gone through and given exactly what Jules Preddy said, but I also talk about a translation, transposing it basically to short-term missions and what it looks like in short-term mission trips. And so hopefully that will be helpful for you guys as you kind of think through the different programs, or maybe it's just a short-term mission trip that you're trying to think through, but thinking through these things in a way that it can actually move people towards that self-mobilization. And essentially, so I'm going to read the translation real quick of the short-term mission trip, but it's when a group of teenagers from a Mexican church have already started reaching out to elderly in the congregation by painting their houses, usually painting 1 to 2 a weekend. The North Carolina church that already has a relationship with this church in Mexico has asked the youth pastor if they can send a team down to partner with the house painting group. Now, if you can imagine that that would be a short-term missions trip that's set up, well, the reason that that could even be set up is because there's a history of a relationship between the two churches, and I talk a lot about that in my book. But oftentimes what happens in these situations is more like a North Carolina church tells a Mexican church, hey, we're going to send a team to paint these houses. Give us a list of names of houses that we can paint, and we're going to do it. That's all that we can do right now. We have a bunch of different people of different age, and this is the only trip that we can afford. This is the only way that we can come and serve you guys. And so really, like, there's a huge difference there between the participation of that Mexican church in that particular situation. So that's what I'm trying to get to with all that stuff, is to really make sure that we understand that we are moving towards right relationship with people when it comes to missions work. And again, just kind of going back to this idea of justice and missions, if we are going to do it this way, then we have to understand that right relationships must be weightier than productivity. So maybe we don't paint a church at all. Maybe you have nothing to show for when you come back, and that's okay, because you build right relationships with people, and that's incredibly important for the kingdom of God. And partnership has to be stronger than paternalism. A lot of times we see a lot of paternalistic short-term missions trips. And it's really quite sad, and again, just mars the identity of the imago Dei in everyone involved. And I think it's really important for integrity to be more tenacious than manipulation. So that's really the essence of my thoughts and my hopes for you guys for this webinar, and I hope it's helpful to you. Again, my book's The Smoldering Wick, Igniting Missions Work with Sustainable Practices, and then my new book coming out is Separated by the Border.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gena, for sharing. That was literally like a International Development 101 class in 20 minutes. I mean, it's really great. You've given us a ton of topics and information, and hopefully for those that are like me, I get little nuggets of this, and then I'm like, I need to go figure out exactly what that means. And so that even that whole typology of participation, I want to go back and like look through each of those and ask those tough questions about what we're doing. Yeah, thank you very much. So while if people want to ask questions, feel free to send those to us. We have some questions that we're going to ask. So I'm going to start by asking one question that we have, and then if others want to add questions, please send that. I'm also going to throw up a poll here that people can fill out just of questions that would, I think, ignite some thoughts. So here's a question I have for you, Gena, and this is one of the challenges as somebody who was a missions pastor and was trying to engage my church well, and so much of engaging a church well is telling the story of what you're doing. But I often found that there was always flirting with this line of telling a story that engaged people, that made them want to be a part of it, and yet not telling a story that caused someone to lose dignity. So how do you balance kind of the marketing aspect of missions work? How we can get people involved, fire up excitement and passion, and yet not cause someone to lose dignity in so doing. That if they were to hear that, they wouldn't feel bothered by what we're saying. How have you dealt with that?
Yeah, it's a really, really tough tension to live in, that's for sure. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize when we talk about this kind of stuff is understanding that pictures are, the old saying, pictures speak 1,000 words, right? Well, I think it's really important for us to understand that pictures are more than that, that pictures are 1 billion words maybe, or maybe even more, but that our lives are just a lot bigger than a picture. And I think one of the things I struggle with a lot, and this is certainly something at the Chalmers Center we try to do well, is to make sure that the pictures that we're sharing of our trips or of those who are economically poor are not kind of marring the identity and the dignity of the people that are there. And so one of the examples that I give in my book is I talk through this idea that if someone were to take a picture of me on my worst day ever, I had like a giant zit on my forehead and I had a horrible haircut and no makeup on whatsoever. And then they kind of share that around to everybody that they know. And they're like, this is who Gena is. Well, that would be really, really sad. Like, that's not who I am. Now, on the other hand, I'm also not like glamatized, I always have makeup on and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's really important that we hold that balance between kind of showing off the best of who we are and showing off the worst of who we are. Whether it's talking about us as missionaries or the people that we're going to serve, it's really important that we understand that balance and we keep that balance. One of the things that I try to do in my second book, Separated by the Border, is that I really try to show how I talk a lot about Honduras and I talk about Mexico, and I think it's important for us to show that there are good things and there are negative things about everywhere we go. There are good and bad, and that's incredibly important to live out. And I think it's very important in the mindset of justice to understand, right, relationship. Human beings are human beings, and they have good days and bad days. And it's not okay to kind of show off this horrible, like half naked child and say, this is what these people are living in, and we have to go help them and we have to help save them, because it really just kind of perpetuates this idea of an American savior, which is not the gospel.
Gena, we got a question from one of the those watching. They asked, for mission organizations who have been getting it wrong for a long time, where should they begin to change from charity to justice? And then they added the comment, it seems so overwhelming. So maybe what are some first steps, a few first steps somebody can take, or a church or an organization can take to begin moving from charity to justice?
Yeah, it's a challenging thing for sure. I guess maybe it would depend on what area we're talking about, but let's say that we just go with the area of missions. There's a couple of different things that I have in my book that kind of talk through partnerships with different churches, different organizations, and making sure that the partnership that you've created with another, let's say a receiving church, let's say sending churches and receiving churches. So let's say that there's a partnership between a sending and a receiving church. It's one of the first steps, I think, is to make sure that partnership is actually the kind of partnership that you hope it is and that they're hoping that it is. One of the difficult things with overseas churches a lot of times, again, is that power play. Well, as Americans, we kind of have resources, we have power, a lot more than we think we do. And so when we go into a church and we say, hey, we're going to do this, they might say, okay. And they might not actually think it's okay. So I think one of the steps to do is to really kind kind of scrutinize those things and make sure that that the partnerships that we have with other churches, other sending organizations and receiving organizations is beneficial for everyone involved. It's mutual. And I think that having like trips where we go and we actually sit down and talk to people and talk about and ask the hard questions and say, are we actually hurting you guys by doing this? Are we helping you? Are we enabling you? Are we empowering you? Which one are we actually doing? And sometimes those conversations can't be had in person. Maybe they just need to be had over video chat. But there's a lot of questions that I have in the book as well to kind of help people steer through and navigate some of that stuff.
Yeah,
that's
actually,
great.
One of the things I would encourage people, you know, if you haven't looked at a Smoldering Wick, one of the things that I think is great about it, I wish I had it when I was a missions pastor, is at the very back, especially if you're working in Latin American countries, Gena's actually put together documents that you can use to do some follow-up questions with the national church that you're working with, the local church in the country you're working in. So they're in English and Spanish, which is why it's great if you're working in Latin America. She has it translated. So if you work with a church and have a great experience, but you want to know what was their experience like, you know, receiving us, there's some great pieces there that allow them to answer some questions honestly and get feedback on that, so that you can make sure that everything you are doing with the critical eye. You know, I think it's always good to go back and ask those questions afterwards. It's so easy to celebrate and then move on, rather than celebrate and take a moment and say, okay, what could we have done differently? What did we do well? And what can we improve on? And I think your resources allow people to take an opportunity, to take a break and actually do that. Not that I'm going to plug your resources the whole time, but I'm definitely plugging them now. It's a great resource.
I appreciate that very much. Thank
Well,
you.
Andrew, I thought you were going to say you loved Smoldering Wick because she quoted you. That's the direction.
I was wondering.
As I told you earlier, I had forgotten she had done that until you mentioned it in our phone call. I have another question. So another question for you. One of the things that I think you talk about that's great in your book, and this could be a long question, but a long response, but I just want to get a quick thought. One of the points you make in your book is that missions shouldn't just be kind of over there experience, that we go somewhere, it's missions, and then we come back. And actually, I think that idea of justice, one of the things that's so valuable about that is it pushes against that idea, because that's really charity. Anytime we're going someone else to do something and coming back and we're removed from it, that's charity. That creates that us and them. But justice is about kind of this intersection of our lives and being a part of who we are. But you talk about it, one of the ways that you approach it that I think is really unique is you talk about it in the sense of fostering. And that fostering is a part of the way that you live out that missional life. So tell me more about that. Why is fostering important to you?
Sorry, guys, I'm moving. I got family hanging out in the living room. So yeah, fostering is really important to me. It was something that wasn't at first, to be very honest. We were kind of trying to adopt while we were overseas, and that didn't work out. And it turned out to be a very good thing for us personally, because it really helped us to recognize where are the vulnerable children in our own country, and what's happening to them. And so I think it's like you said, that whole idea of justice. We have to be aware that our relationships are important where we live. And anytime we're talking about sustainable solutions to anything, we really need to be living in that context to even have that conversation. And so fostering really just kind of came up through this, like, always wanted to adopt internationally. But the more I learned from my international development degree, the more I started thinking locally and trying to really understand why do I want to go to another community and adopt? And I'm not saying that it's bad for everyone, but I think it was for me, because I think it was easy for me to look at other people and to say, this child needs a home and I need to provide it. Instead of really trying to understand what is the systems in our own country, in our own context, that kind of keep people, keep children vulnerable. So that was a big thing for us, and really getting involved in fostering. So we fostered for about a year last year. And it just really opened up our eyes to see an America that we didn't know. And it's always been around the corner, but we have always been blind to it. And so it was really eye-opening in so many ways and helpful to understand different situations that people were living in and going through, whether it was drug related or violence related or neglect. There's all these different reasons for the system to be in place, and the system is very broken. It's very much in need of reform, but it's also very much in need of people to really get involved in it and to show vulnerable children that live right around the corner from our house that we care about them. It's easy for me to go to an orphanage overseas and to say, oh, I love this child, I think they're amazing. But that love is only so deep because I get to leave them and come back home and do my own thing. And so actually inviting foster children into our home showed us how little we did love other children. It's hard. It's really, really hard, and it's messy, and it's just, it costs a lot. And I think that's really what the Bible's getting at when it's talking about justice, is that this is a tough, tough standard. It's a hard standard, but right relationship is so important to the Lord, and certainly helps us grow in our understanding of what the gospel is, for sure, without a doubt. So.
Got another question from an attendee. This is a very practical question, I guess, and maybe if you have an example or a story to kind of go along with it. But he's asking, what would you recommend? So in the context of short-term missions, there's some pre-trip preparation, talking through some of this stuff, with the team. You get on the ground and there's just that one person in the group that they're the compassion, I guess, the charity that we talked about just overwhelms them so much that they break the rules of engagement and that sort of thing. How do you work with that person? What do you say? What do you do in that instance? Is that something you've experienced or seen experience that maybe you can kind of share that as well?
Yeah, there's always that one person, isn't there? At least one, right? Maybe sometimes five.
Yeah, at least one.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly a challenging thing. And I think one of the important things to recognize is what kind of relationship do you have with that person? And one of the things and I know this is a hard thing to do, but one of the things I talk about in the book is to really try, if you are a missions pastor, to really try to only bring people who you do have good relationship with, so that you can approach them and say, hey, this is really harmful actions that you're taking right now. And even though they don't seem harmful to you, they are in the long run. And so I think if we can cultivate teams where we have that right relationship between the team and amongst the team, where accountability is not something that is kind of looked down upon, but something that's welcomed. I think that's super important. And maybe even in the pre-training, probably some of this needs to come up there, where you talk to people and you say, look, when we're on this trip, like if you do some of this stuff, like I am going to approach you and I am going to tell you that you can't do this anymore. And like, kind of go through some of that stuff and talk through some of it, because there were a lot of teams that came down that didn't have any training prior to. And really the saddest thing about it all is that those attitudes and those behaviors actually damages the community that's living there a lot more than it damages the people who are, or at least visibly, I would say. I do think that it damages psychologically all of us, but I think the visible damage is seen much more on the actual ground than it is seen through the team that's there. So there were a lot of times where we would kind of have to go and talk to the local pastor afterwards and say, I'm really sorry about this that happened, and I hope that you don't think that we as American Christians believe this or do this or whatever. And we kind of have to repent on behalf of the Americans that come to do work. And so it is really challenging, for sure. I hope that there is previous relationship with that person. And I think if you're bringing random new people in on the trip, I just don't think it's a justice-minded trip, to be very honest. I know that's hard.
How would you describe the the relationship, maybe the ideal relationship between a church that's going on the short-term missions trip, the local church, wherever they're going to partner, or organization, maybe it's a children's care facility, something like that, and the missionary. What the missionary on the ground, what would be the best case relationship in that scenario?
Between the local pastor or church or organization and the local
missionary and the church group from North America coming down or coming over.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to my context, but there were certainly a couple of churches that that didn't do this relationship well, and then there's one that I can think of that did it really well. And that church had come down several times. We were there in northern Mexico for about 4.5 years, and they had come down, I think, at least 3, maybe 4 times while we were there, and they had come prior to us being there. And so I think one of the things is that it's a repetitive thing. The church is not, the sending church is not trying to just kind of go to a bunch of different places to check off different places on their maps at their homes. I think that's a huge thing. I think on top of that, the church has constant communication with the missionary. And if it's possible for them to actually have communication with the local pastor, that's happening as well. One of the interesting things that happened with this one church that was very healthy was that they came and helped they helped several times with the church build school related things because the church had a school connected to it. But one of the things they did was help put a roof on the 2nd floor of the school. And when they did that, prior to doing that, they had asked the local pastor, they had already been in good relationship with him. They had asked him, okay, what have you done since the last time we've been here? And what are you planning to do when we leave? And how does what we're doing here kind of fit into what you're already doing? And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle, is that it's not just we're going to come down and put this roof on so that we can tell our church that we put a roof on a school, but that we're coming here to kind of come alongside what you're already doing, and we're just boosting it and empowering you to do it more. And that certainly needs to happen with a missionary involved. Well, not always, but with a missionary involved, that's a lot better, I think, than when that person is not involved or has to kind of get stepped over in order to talk to the pastor all the time. So if it can be a constant communication between all three, I think that's where I've seen it the healthiest.
That's great. That's helpful. Thank you.
And oftentimes the local missionary will have to kind of push both sides. They're really a bridge person. Maybe it's not a missionary, maybe it's just a local pastor who knows the culture of the United States. But kind of have to be a bridge and be like, okay, no, you need to ask this question, or you should talk about this, or tell them that you don't like this. Make sure you speak your mind on this stuff. And that was one of the things we had to do with our local pastor a lot in Mexico, was say, okay, I know you said it's okay, but is it really okay? Let's really talk about this right now, because you need to tell us if it's not, and please don't just tell us that it is, because we're Americans. So
I think that's so important. I think that's something we miss, is that bridge person, or as churches move out on their own to do a lot of work on their own, I think they maybe overestimate their ability to be that bridge person on the ground. And I think that is just a huge reminder that, again, whether it's a national that understands both cultures, or whether it's a missionary, you have to have somebody that can be the kind of interlocutor between the two. And again, like you said, push both sides. It's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Gena, thank you so much for being with us today, sharing some of your thoughts and your experience. I'm going to be sending that email with the PDF here in just a second. So if you don't receive it, please let us know and we can get it to you. Or we'll be uploading it to our website with the webinar in the coming days, and you can find it there.